I've been very much looking forward to presenting your work, because it's so close to what I'm doing. So it's very exciting. Except you're looking at Goethe from a very different angle than I am, but it's very exciting. Donald joined the School of Education in 2005, and he has a background in science education, curriculum development, and educational research. He worked for the Scottish Council for Research and Education, the University of Strathclyde, and the Humboldt University in Berlin before joining us at the University of Aberdeen. And he is particularly interested in complexity, science and sustainability, Goethean science, and environmental education. He has a long-standing interest in outdoor learning and the theoretical perspectives underpinning the value of outdoor, natural, environmental, experiential education, with a particular reference to what's called 4E cognition: embodied, embedded, inactive, and extended. And Donald is involved in various projects relating to food growing and food activism in educational contexts. I would look forward to also hearing more about that. And today he will talk about Johann Wolfgang von Goethe as a scientist. I come from a literary perspective, so we know him mostly for his literature, but this will be very new, and how we might consider his methods and work in ways that are relevant today. So I will give the word to you, Donald.
Okay. Thank you very much. I'm just going to put the PowerPoint on my screen so that I can see what I'm talking about. Thanks for that introduction. It was useful actually to have that, because it provides that background from which I am coming and how I arrived at this Goethean science. As I say, my background is as a science educator, so my own science education has been the very traditional kind of science education that most science students go through, and in all that time I'd never heard of Goethe as a scientist, and hadn't really been introduced to any other ways of looking at science. But it's over time that I began to get a little bit dissatisfied with some things, particularly when it came to sustainability issues, and wondering why, if science is so great, why do we have all these problems? And it's not a simple case of that science got it wrong. There is that complexity of relationships with business and corporate things. But there is, I would suggest, a kind of mindset in the traditional reductive way of doing science that lends itself to this rather non-sustainable approach to ecological issues or environmental issues. And it was through reading around that I eventually, and the emergence of things like complexity, that I was reading Brian Goodwin, who's a theoretical biologist, who in one of his books, and I think it was called How the Leopard Changed Its Spots or something like that, he mentioned things. He mentioned holistic science, and also mentioned Goethe, and that kind of triggered the spark that several years actually down the line I started looking at this a little bit more detail. I wouldn't say that I'm an expert. I'm still reading, I'm still finding out, I'm still trying to get these ideas make sense to me. So this exercise that we're doing today, the seminar, is part of that development, and I'm hoping that people will contribute to the discussion. But first of all, Goethe, he's who was he? Who was Goethe? Well, he's probably better known as a literary figure. He was born in August the 28th in 1749 in Frankfurt am Main. His grandfather was called Friedrich Georg Goethe, who was a well-to-do tailor who came into more money through a second marriage to a wealthy widow, Cornelia Schelling. His father, Johann Caspar Goethe, inherited the family wealth, but he became a lawyer and eventually an advisor to Frankfurt City Council. He married Katharine Elizabeth Textor, who happened to be the daughter of Johann Wolfgang Textor, who was the secretary to the city council in Frankfurt. So it could be suggested that it was a political move as well as an amorous move to marry the daughter of a prominent person. But anyway, the first child was Johann Wolfgang Goethe, who was named after the maternal grandfather. Later in 1765, he studied law for a couple of years, but became quite ill and at some point left, went back to Frankfurt. Then he went to Strasbourg to finish his studies. But he wasn't just interested in literature and philosophy, which he was. He had a wide interest also, and in Strasbourg studied chemistry and anatomy. Later on, well, as you can see the date line there, he was a young man and writing, and he wrote this novel, The Sorrows of Young Werther. That's the translation. I can't remember how it is in German now, but it became a sensation essentially, and quite controversial as well. But that made Goethe famous at a young age of 23 throughout Europe. In 1775, he met the Prince Karl August, who kind of became his mentor, not mentor, but he associate. They had a strong bond, and he later on invited him to Weimar, where he served the Duke. The prince became the Duchy of Saxe-Weimar, Eisenach. Later on in his 18th birthday, and Goethe then became served the Weimar in Weimar under the Duke. But what's interesting is the scientific side of things. So I want to focus a little bit on some of the key developments in Goethe's science and why it's a little bit different from what we might come to expect. Although there are, I'll come to that later on. I think there are things that we would expect science to do, which Goethe does, but there are also significant differences. So one of the first things, early thing, was the intermaxillary bone, and he actually met a medical doctor called Justus Christian Loder in Jena in 1780, and he wanted to study anatomy, but his anatomical studies were originally aimed at, he oversaw the Weimar drawing school, so it was associated with learning anatomy for the purpose of drawing. And that will come through quite a bit in Goethe's science about the importance of art and drawing and so on, that perhaps influenced a little bit the way he approached things. So he studied anatomy almost on a daily basis during 1780 with Loder, and also had discussions with, and I have to remember the name, Johann Gottlieb Herder, who was quite influential at the time and influenced the young Goethe in his literary form, but also had lots of discussions philosophically and about his work. And the key thing here is the intermaxillary bone, is that at the time, that was what the science set human beings apart from the rest of the animals. I'm not going to go into the detail of what it is, but it's a bone in which in the upper jaw, which has particular location in relation to the teeth, and it's not very visible in human beings, but Goethe's studies, he looked at loads and loads and loads of skulls and very detailed observations over a period of time, over those 3 years. And also said that, in actual fact, some scientists earlier on had suggested there may be a bone there, but it was generally accepted that in the science at the time that this set human beings apart from the rest of the animal kingdom. So human beings were unique. But as I say, Goethe's studies, particularly in suggesting that it was more visible in the human embryo, led to his writing an essay in 1784, Dem Menschen wie den Tieren ist ein Zwischenknochen der oberen Kinnlade zuzuschreiben. An intermaxillary bone of the upper jaw is ascribed to man as well as to animals. Now, this kind of was a little bit controversial, and there were scientists who had been suggesting that the absence of the intermaxillary bone set humans aside from other animals. There, Blumenbach was one name. But this kind of changed the view of human relationships with the rest of the animal kingdom. But I think it also set the conditions for later studies that Goethe undertook, which relates to the archetype, but I'll come to that a little bit later. So the next more prominent thing, and perhaps one of the most notable event, well, there are two notable events, but the Goethe's Italian journey. Again, at the time, he left Weimar quite unexpectedly. I think the pressures of being famous and work at Weimar and so on had got to him. But he was also very interested in art, and he wanted to develop his artistic skills, and wanted to really go into Italy and art. Look at the art, studies in art. But in the process of doing that, he studied plants. He was doing botanical studies, and it was through these botanical studies that he developed his idea, which became, he published as the metamorphosis of plants. You can see the quote there from to his future wife, Charlotte von Stein. I cannot tell you how readable the book of nature is becoming for me. My long efforts at deciphering letter by letter have helped me. Now all of a sudden it is having its effect, and my quiet joy is inexpressible. So the botanical studies really did develop his thinking quite a bit. And I'm going to read a little bit from, this is Chris Holdridge, who runs the Nature Institute in the United States. And he says that Goethe's botanical research was initially guided by his study of Linnaeus' Philosophica Botanica, a foundational work on plant systematics and botanical terminology. So he was interested in this, but when he came to be looking at the plants, he thought, well, you know, it's very difficult actually to give a precise identification, because when you look at plants and try to identify on the basis of the leaves are so different across plants. And sorry, I mentioned this. The book that came out of this, the Metamorphosis of Plants, and I'm going to come back to that because I want to skip on to this. This was what I was talking about. The leaves in plants are very different if you look at them, and this is the study that was done by Chris Holdridge. He took a lot of different plants and to illustrate how different they can be, but. And he says, what impressed Goethe was the variety and variability in plants. He looked at them in detail and did not gloss over differences, but the differences were not of the kind that would allow hard and fast boundaries between plant parts or even species and genera. He came to see plants as dynamic and transforming organisms, and that term dynamic comes in because when science tends to treat things very statically, so we get a plant classification which is based on particular descriptors, but actually when you look very closely at something, you see that there is variation even within that plant, within that organism, and that can be important. And the other aspect of this, he talks about the metamorphosis of plants, and eventually what he came to the conclusion is that essentially the parts of the plant are all really related, that they come from the leaf So the leaf is a kind of foundational part of a plant, which then develops into other forms, the calyx, the petal, and the reproductive plants, the parts, so on. So there's a relationship between each of the parts of a plant. One is a dynamic form that is constantly developing and coming into being in itself. So that was the kind of development of his botanical thinking. But he also had another thing that perhaps the other aspect which is prominent in his science is the idea of colour, which I'll come to just in a second. And he objected to Newtonian science. Newton preceded Goethe, but what Goethe objected to was the kind of reductive nature and the mathematization of science, so turning everything into a mathematical idea. And Goethe had borrowed a prism from a friend to kind of have a look at the idea of colour, trying to look at Newton's things, but he didn't do anything with it until he had to give this prism back to the friend. And he had about a week, so he spent a week intensively looking at the formation of the colours in from white light. But what he noticed, and this again it's quite well described by David Seaman in one of his books about the process here, and having done this kind of thing as well in a workshop that I did last year, took part in last year. It's really quite interesting to see what Goethe saw, because his idea was when he read Newton, he thought, well, if I take a prism and look at it through the prism onto a white wall or something, I should see all the colours of the rainbow or something. But in actual fact, that didn't happen, because what he discovered was that when you look through a prism, the forms of the different colours actually manifest themselves at the borders, at the edges of things. And he found that the arrangement of the colours depended on the juxtaposition of dark and light aspects. So if you have a sheet of black paper and a sheet of white paper, then the colours will manifest along the edge of the border. And it always takes a particular form, and depending on the way in which the paper is aligned, you will get a red to yellow little band, or it might be a blue to violet band. And it was through this that Goethe developed his ideas, which became kind of disputed. And he thought that light then was some kind of relationship between dark and light, that the colours were a manifestation of dark and light. And he started developing this idea. And clearly that has been found to be wanting, but the method that he used and the observations that he made actually do have significance, not for mathematical science of colour, but for the physiological science of colour, how we perceive colour, how we see things. And even Newton was aware that actually we can't see what Newton was describing in mathematical terms. We see them differently, but the Newtonian aspect has been developed as a mathematical formation. But what and this has been recognized quite a bit. Even Heisenberg, the famous quantum scientist, has said, he said, it has been said that Goethe's and Newton's methods proceeded in two entirely different directions. While Newton obviously endeavoured to open the world of colour to exact measurement and thus to create order in the world by mathematical methods similar to those he had so successfully employed in mechanics, such mathematical considerations do not figure in Goethe's work. On the contrary, Goethe explicitly dispensed with all relations of his theory to mathematics, though he stressed that the assistance of exact measurement may have been desirable in some instances. And he goes on there. So there's a lot of things about colour which I haven't the time to or haven't developed that aspect. But the important thing is that what we have here are two different ways of looking at a phenomenon. One is to reduce that phenomenon to a mathematical way of analyzing things, and the other, Goethe's way, is to how do we perceive it, and this is where we start to get this separation between the reductive mathematical science of Newton, Descartes, and the more what's now perhaps being called the phenomenological approach to science, which is where the viewer is actually participating in the object that is being looked at, or so you begin to develop this relationship with the thing that's being viewed, and if, as I say, the importance of Goethe's thing has become associated with physiological. So how we see colour, so the complementary colours, as in the colour circle you see there, and I can't remember what the term is now for when you stare at a coloured shape on a piece of white, or just stare at a coloured shape, and then for a few minutes, and then you look at a white screen or a white sheet of paper, you will see the complementary colour of that shape you've looked at. So if it was, I think, red, it would become a green colour on the white screen, and that's the physiological effect. So we learned a lot about how colour is perceived through Goethe's work, even although the mathematical aspect, the physics aspect of it wasn't dealt with. And the method, I want to say a little bit about the method. How are we doing for time? Yeah, okay, I'll move on. The thing about Goethe's method is it's sometimes called a phenomenological method, and it's very much based on deep observation and looking at things very, very closely in lots of different ways. And that's one of the things that Goethe objected to, was the single experiment. He said you can't just do a single experiment to determine something. You have to really look at it. And there is a process which is, when it's being described, is very phenomenological, but this is long before Husserl, who I think was about 100 years later. But the idea is similar. Goethe said, get rid of all your preconceptions, get rid of everything that you actually bring to the observation, and look at things as closely as you can. Describe everything. Just describe it. Don't even bring in things that you know, like you don't call a leaf. You would just describe what you see and do it very methodically. So that's the exact sense perception. And it leads through into the process, leads through into a very detailed involvement with the thing that is being looked at, that's being examined, to the point where, and you can see there in stage 4, which this is the one I think people find quite difficult, is being one with the object. Goethe would say you basically get to know the organism so well that you can actually imagine how it is developing, how it works, how it functions, and so on. So that there's that aspect of the Goethe's method. And as I said, you set aside all your categorical preconceptions in order to see the phenomenon in pure form. And as Brooks says, Goethe points to all of these qualities when he speaks of seeing phenomenon with a certain purity of mind. But one should not make the mistake of assuming that Goethe recommended a naive or pre-critical view. He was very clear about the importance of exact observation of detailed analysis of things. And he called this process delicate empiricism. He had the holistic approach to studying nature, which he referred to as delicate empiricism. And as I say, importance of careful observation, intuition, and subjective experience in understanding the natural world, in contrast to the reductionist methods of traditional science. So Goethe believed that a deep appreciation of the interconnectedness and unity of nature was essential for gaining true insight into its workings. And as you read about Goethe, you come across the holistic, the idea of whole, and how the parts are contained within the whole, and the whole is contained within the parts. And there's this dynamic relationship. And you could only understand things by, if you isolate something, for example, in the intermaxillary bone, you isolate that. All it tells you is that this animal is different from that animal. It doesn't really tell you what the importance of that bone is in relation to the context within which the animal lives, how it lives, what it eats, and so on. So all this detailed understanding of the part, how the part plays a part within the whole organism, is absolutely fundamental to Goethean science. So the whole and the parts, whereas reductive science slices out a bit, looks at it in separation from the whole thing. So you only really understand that part in isolation, and the way in which that part plays a part is lost because you are not looking at it in relation to the whole thing. And so this is the important aspect of Goethean science, I think, which has relevance to today and contemporary ideas. And one of the people who's written quite a bit about this is Henry Bortoff, about the way of seeing. Bortoff was a physicist. He went on to do more philosophy of science, and he's written a couple of books, which the second of which is called Taking Appearance Seriously, and this is where this quote's taken from. So Goethe redirects attention into the concrete particularity of sense experience. And again, this is another aspect which is separate from the way science uses machines or instruments to separate the human element from the thing being observed. Whereas Goethe made emphasis of the kind of the importance of the senses in understanding things. He does this by active looking and in the practice of exact sensorial imagination. And imagination, again, is critical to this thing. It is through the activation of the sensory that we come to encounter the phenomenon in a dynamic way, so that we begin to experience the phenomenon as coming into being, whereas relying on the intellectual mind only brings us into contact with the phenomenon as it has already become. So this process is understanding how things come about and how they are related to other things. And this term was used by Frederick Amorin. He called it the metamorphosis of the scientist. And in a sense, the process of doing Goethean science is designed to change the scientists themselves. So Goethe's scientific ideal is to allow oneself to be transformed in following the transformation of the phenomena. So you enter into the phenomenon that you're observing, and in such a depth that you begin to understand, you can imagine what it is like to be that thing. And so there's a metamorphosis of the scientist. And one of the key things is the idea of the phenomenon, the archetypal phenomenon, which again, I think it was Herder that Goethe had been talking with. The idea, and this was around in the scientific establishment, the idea of whether animals, plants have an archetype, something from which everything else emerges, an ideal form. This is not my area of really understanding. I'm still grappling with this, but essentially, you can have the idea that there's some precursor to everything from which everything evolved, and it all emerges from one thing, or that there is another type of archetype, which again, from which other things emerge. And there was a big discussion about this, and this is one of the things that that Goethe was concerned with, trying to imagine the form which contains the elements of everything else. This is what you said. And moreover, an archetypal phenomenon is not to be considered as a principle from which manifold consequences result, but rather to be seen as a fundamental appearance within which the manifold is to be held. So that, and you can see why some of these ideas with the bones and the plants actually influenced evolutionary theory. If not directly, but they laid the ground for an acceptance of, I had a note someplace which I have lost. Here it is. But I'm conscious of time moving on. So I will try and wind up. So we've got the influences. Alexander von Humboldt, if you haven't read Andrea Wolf's The Invention of Nature, which is all about Alexander von Humboldt, I recommend that you do it, because it's a great book and really explains how the young Humboldt drew on ideas from Goethe and developed his own ideas. But also Charles Darwin, as I say, some of these things that Goethe was talking about had a kind of set the ground for being able to have acceptance of acceptance of evolutionary theory, particularly in Germany at the time, and but also Charles Darwin acknowledges the influence of Goethe in The Origin of the Species. He does mention Goethe in that vein. This again is from Frederick Amarant, who's written quite a bit about this as well. And he says that actually, while Goethe is recognized as a literary figure, he actually said that he would like to be recognized and remembered more as a scientist than as a poet. And I've only mentioned a few things here, but he did do other studies, meteorological and geological studies. Because he oversaw the mines in Weimar and so on, and he spent a lot of time looking at rocks and minerals and so on. And so the three things I've mentioned are the physiological optics, animal morphology, and botany. And Goethe did coin the term morphology or morphological in relation to development of animals and plants. So it is suggested that he is worth looking at from this point, and there's quite a bit of his own writing. I've done nearly all my stuff through secondhand, although there is the Maxims, which he is good, and Jeremy Nadler has a good book which has extracts from that of Goethe's science writing, and it's something I'm still working my way through as well. Contemporary significance. I'm going to read just a little bit from Craig Holdridge again, which he says, as we have seen, adequate understanding in Goethe's view can only be gained when we consider the relations and connections in which any given thing is embedded. This is ecology understood as a way of knowing. It is not a matter of content because it applies to the way we study any phenomenon, whether they be rocks, cells, or whole organism. It leads to an ecological view of the world in which everything is interconnected. So Goethe, the ecologist, well, I'm not going to read out that, but he has a quote from Goethe showing the importance of the relationships that we have. And I think that is important. One is towards a way of attending to the world, which most of the time doesn't happen in education, which is my interest. But we need to kind of cultivate this. One is the imagination, one is the deep engagement with things, one is the relationships amongst things, which tend not to be dealt with in schools and other educational establishments, except for one, which I'll mention shortly. I did mention art earlier on, and art plays an important part in Goethe's development. And there's also a book called New Eyes for Plants, which is a drawing workshop. Nigel Hoffman talks about the artist and its importance of the importance of art in Goethean science. Margaret Colquhoun sadly died, I think, about 20 years ago. I think maybe not 20 years ago, maybe 10 years ago. But she was a biologist as well, but set up the Life Science Centre in Pishwanton Woods, which is just outside Edinburgh. It's now been taken over, and I forget the name of the organisation, but Margaret Colquhoun kind of moved the Goethean science thinking, and this is a workbook where she looks at the way in which you can develop a Goethean approach through drawing with the artist Axel Ewald. And I would say that this is also important because today there is, you'll probably all have heard of STEM, science, technology, engineering, maths. Now there is STEAM, which is adding the arts into STEM subjects to try and develop this cultivation of creativity and imagination, which we know happens in the sciences, but this is a more deliberate way. These are just a couple of pictures from a workshop that I took part in last year. There is a small group of people who ran some workshops last year, and this was actually one of the people, Ian, who lives in the Borders, who's was a pharmacist and but now is embedded in Goethean science and art. He has his own art studio. So there's an interesting exercises that can be done. Rudolf Steiner was the editor of Goethe's works and was highly influenced by Goethe and the development of Goethe's thinking, which led to it being adopted in significant part by Waldorf education. And that's an area I'm planning to have a closer look at. There is a Waldorf, the Waldorf School in Aberdeen, I think, has closed, but there is still one in Edinburgh. And it's an area I'm looking at because I'm particularly interested in how we can develop, usefully inject these kind of ideas into mainstream science education. Waldorf is not mainstream and it's got a very different view of things. There's loads of books out there. I'm just going to put a few in there that I've drawn on. You can see that I mentioned complexity theory. There's even a book that looks at Goethe's ideas in relation to chaos and complexity. Jeremy Nadler, Goethe on Science, that's the extracts. The Romantic Conception of Life I've got sitting here because I was looking into it before this session this morning, and I realized that I've gone way over my time, so I'm going to stop there. And where are we? We can come back to screen, I think.